Zelma had always been the type to arrive exactly on time. Not early, which suggested desperation, and certainly not late, which implied disrespect. She pulled into the parking lot of Hillcrest High School at precisely 6:58 p.m., 2 minutes before the reunion was scheduled to begin. The autumn evening carried the scent of dying leaves and distant wood smoke. She sat in her modest sedan, a practical choice, reliable transportation that served its purpose without drawing attention, and watched former classmates emerge from luxury SUVs and sports cars. Designer handbags caught the amber glow of the parking lot lights. Laughter echoed across the asphalt, the kind of carefree sound that money could buy. Zelma checked her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her dress was simple but elegant, purchased from a department store during a modest sale. Her hair was styled neatly, her makeup subtle. She looked like what she was, a woman who lived within her means, who chose substance over flash. She gathered her purse and stepped out into the crisp October air. Through the gymnasium windows, she could see the warm glow of reunion decorations, silhouettes of people already mingling inside. 25 years since graduation. A quarter of a century since she'd walked these halls, since she'd been nobody special in a sea of nobodies who thought they were somebodies. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Zelma glanced at the screen, smiled softly, and typed back a single word. Ready. The response came immediately. The trust transferred this morning. Everything is in place. 3 months earlier, Zelma Whitmore had been sitting in the sterile waiting room of Mercy General Hospital, holding her husband's calloused hand as machines monitored the steady decline of the only person who had ever truly seen her. Erasmus had been a good man. Not wealthy, not particularly ambitious in the ways the world typically measured such things, but good in the way that mattered when you were building a life with someone. He fixed cars for honest wages, treated every customer like family, and never once made Zelma feel small for being the quiet girl who'd rather read than socialize. They'd met at the public library 15 years ago, both reaching for the same book on Civil War history. He'd insisted she take it first, and she'd been charmed by his genuine interest when she'd told him about her master's degree in history, the degree she'd earned through night classes while working 2 jobs. The achievement no one from high school would have expected from unremarkable Zelma Pickering. "You know what I love about you?" Erasmus had said during one of their last coherent conversations, his voice weakened by the cancer that was claiming him piece by piece. "You never needed anyone to tell you who you were." She'd wanted to argue, to tell him about all the times she'd felt invisible, about the high school years when Prudence Hartwell and her circle had made her feel like furniture in their presence. But Erasmus's eyes were already drifting closed, and she'd chosen to let him keep his version of her truth. After the funeral, the house felt impossibly large and impossibly small at the same time. Erasmus's tools still hung organized on the garage wall. His coffee mug, the one with the faded logo from a fishing tournament he'd won in 1987, sat in the sink because Zelma couldn't bring herself to wash it. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional sympathy casserole delivery from neighbors who didn't know what else to do with their discomfort around grief. It was during the 3rd week of this suspended existence that the letter arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper that felt substantial between her fingers. The return address bore the name of a law firm she didn't recognize, Ashworth, Blackwell and Associates. Inside, a brief note in elegant script requested her presence at their downtown office at her earliest convenience regarding a matter of significant inheritance. Zelma read the letter 3 times before setting it aside. She had no wealthy relatives, no forgotten connections to money. Her parents had died years ago, leaving behind more debt than assets. Erasmus's family consisted of a sister in Oregon who sent Christmas cards and nothing else. The letter had to be a mistake, a mix-up with someone who shared her name. But the address was correct. Her full name, including the maiden name she'd rarely used since marriage, Zelma Prudence Pickering Whitmore. The middle name stopped her cold. She'd been named for her grandmother, but she'd always gone by Zelma. Only one person had ever regularly used her full name, and that person had done so with particular cruelty during their shared teenage years. Prudence Hartwell had delighted in the coincidence of their shared name, using it as ammunition in the small wars that defined high school social hierarchies. "Look, it's the other Prudence," she'd announce whenever Zelma entered a room. "Though I suppose one of us will have to change our name eventually. Can't have 2 Prudences in the same social circle." The implication, of course, was that Zelma would never be part of any social circle that mattered. Now, staring at the lawyer's letter, Zelma felt the peculiar sensation of her 2 worlds, past and present, beginning to converge in ways she couldn't yet understand. She made the appointment for the following Tuesday. The law offices of Ashworth, Blackwell, and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of one of downtown's more distinguished buildings. Zelma rode the elevator to the 20th floor, her palms slightly damp despite the cool October weather. The receptionist, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair, led her through corridors lined with oil paintings and leather-bound legal volumes to a corner office where sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind an enormous mahogany desk sat a man who appeared to be in his early 60s, his suit impeccably tailored, his manner formal but not unkind. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, rising to shake her hand. "I'm Cornelius Ashworth. Thank you for coming in." "I'm afraid there might be some mistake," Zelma began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "I can't imagine why I would be involved in any inheritance matter." Cornelius opened a thick file folder and regarded her thoughtfully. "Before we begin, I need to verify some information. You were born Zelma Prudence Pickering on March 15, 1980, in this city?" "Yes." "You attended Hillcrest High School, graduating in 1998? A flutter of unease. "Yes." "And you knew a young woman named Temperance Hartwell during your high school years?" The name hit her like cold water. "Not Prudence, Temperance." Temperance Hartwell, Prudence's older sister who had died in a car accident during Zelma's junior year. A tragedy that had temporarily united the school in grief, though Zelma had only known Temperance peripherally. She'd been 2 years ahead, beautiful and popular in the effortless way that seemed to run in the Hartwell family. "I knew of her," Zelma said carefully. "She was older than me. We weren't friends." Cornelius nodded and withdrew a document from the folder. Temperance Hartwell created a trust in her name shortly before her death. She was 18, legally able to make such arrangements despite her age. The trust was quite specific in its terms. He slid the document across the desk. Zelma's eyes scanned the legal language, struggling to make sense of the formal terminology. Certain phrases jumped out: in recognition of witnessed cruelty, to right observed wrongs, justice long delayed. "I don't understand," she said. The trust was funded by Temperance's life insurance policy, a policy her parents had purchased for her when she turned 18, as they had for her younger sister. $50,000, which has been carefully invested for the past 25 years. Zelma's breath caught. 25 years? The trust specified that the funds could only be released under very particular circumstances. The beneficiary you had to be verified as the person described in the trust documents. And there was a timing element tied to your high school reunion. "My reunion is next month." "Yes." Temperance's instructions were quite specific. The funds were to be made available exactly 30 days before your 25-year reunion, provided you were still living in this city and could be located. Cornelius leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Whitmore, you are now the beneficiary of a trust worth approximately $430,000. The number didn't immediately register. Zelma stared at the lawyer, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say $430,000? "Yes. 25 years of careful investment and compound interest." The office seemed to tilt slightly. Zelma gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process this impossible information. "Why me? I barely knew Temperance Hartwell." Cornelius consulted another document. According to her instructions, she witnessed her sister treating you with particular cruelty on multiple occasions. She specifically mentions an incident in the school cafeteria where you were publicly humiliated, and another at a school dance where you were deliberately excluded from a group photograph. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity. The cafeteria incident, Prudence had announced loudly that there wasn't room at their table for charity cases when Zelma had approached with her lunch tray, looking for somewhere to sit. The dance. The photographer had been taking pictures of Prudence's group when Zelma had been standing nearby. When she'd inadvertently stepped into the frame, Prudence had made a show of asking her to move because some people don't belong in certain pictures. Temperance saw all of that? According to these documents, yes. She also states that she attempted to intervene on several occasions but was. Cornelius paused, searching for the right words. She felt complicit in a system that allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Zelma sat in stunned silence. She remembered Temperance as confident, popular, seemingly untouchable. The idea that she had been paying attention to the small cruelties visited upon an unremarkable underclassman was almost harder to believe than the money itself. "There's more," Cornelius continued gently. "The trust includes specific instructions for how you might choose to use these funds." Temperance had very particular thoughts about justice and accountability. He handed her another document, this one written in a younger hand, less formal than the legal paperwork. At the top, in careful script, for Zelma Prudence Pickering, who deserved better. Zelma spent the next 2 weeks reading and rereading Temperance's letter. It was written in the voice of an 18-year-old girl grappling with mortality and meaning, but the observations were sharp, the intentions clear. "I've been thinking about fairness a lot lately," one passage read. "About how some people get away with being cruel because nobody ever makes them face consequences. My sister thinks the world belongs to her, and maybe it does, but that doesn't make it right." The letter outlined Temperance's plan in startling detail. She had observed the social dynamics of their high school with the keen eye of an anthropologist, noting who held power and how they wielded it. She had seen the damage that casual cruelty could inflict, the way systematic exclusion could shape a person's sense of self-worth. "You probably don't remember me paying attention," she wrote, "but I was. I saw how they treated you, and I saw how you handled it. You never fought back, never tried to hurt them the way they hurt you. That takes a different kind of strength than what people usually recognize." The trust wasn't just about money, Zelma realized. It was about providing options, about giving someone who had been powerless a chance to choose their own form of justice. Temperance had researched Prudence's family, their business interests, their social connections. She had identified vulnerabilities and opportunities, creating what she called a roadmap for accountability. "I don't know what kind of person you'll become," the letter continued, "but I hope you'll be someone who uses power differently than the people who never gave you any." Among Temperance's papers was a manila folder labeled Insurance Policies, not Financial Insurance, but Information. Copies of disciplinary records, evidence of academic dishonesty, documentation of behavior that painted a picture of systematic abuse of privilege. She had been building a case, Zelma realized, creating accountability where none had existed. The most devastating piece was a recording, made on a small cassette recorder that Temperance had apparently carried in her purse. The sound quality was poor, but the voices were unmistakable, Prudence and her friends discussing their intentional campaign to socially isolate certain classmates, laughing about the effectiveness of their methods. The fat girl in AP history actually cried in the bathroom. Prudence's voice crackled through the speakers. Mission accomplished. Zelma had been in AP history. She remembered crying in the bathroom after Prudence had made a comment about how some people's opinions don't really matter, when Zelma had attempted to contribute to a class discussion. But perhaps the most chilling document was a detailed psychological profile that Temperance had apparently compiled with the help of a college psychology textbook. She had diagnosed her sister as displaying narcissistic tendencies with sadistic features, noting specific behaviors and patterns that supported her conclusions. "She needs to believe she's superior to other people," the profile read. "Not just different, actually better, more deserving, more important. When that belief is threatened, she becomes vicious. The only thing that might actually reach her is being forced to face consequences in a way she can't manipulate or escape." At the bottom of the folder was a business card. Cornelius Ashworth, attorney at law. A handwritten note was attached. "Mr. Ashworth specializes in cases involving fraud, defamation, and financial misconduct. He has agreed to assist with implementation of any accountability measures you might choose to pursue." Zelma stared at the card, understanding finally dawning. This wasn't just inheritance, it was an arsenal. Temperance had spent her final months creating the tools for a reckoning that she herself would never live to see. The question now was what Zelma would choose to do with them. The reunion invitation arrived on the same day Zelma completed her first meeting with the private investigator Cornelius had recommended. Octavia Reeves was a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the methodical manner of someone who had spent decades uncovering other people's secrets. 25 years is a long time, Octavia said, spreading photographs across the conference table. People change. Sometimes they improve. Sometimes they just get better at hiding who they really are. The photos told a story of ascending privilege. Prudence Hartwell, now Prudence Hartwell Morrison, had married well. Her husband, Crispin Morrison, came from old money and had expanded it through a series of successful real estate ventures. They lived in the most exclusive neighborhood, sent their children to private schools, and appeared regularly in the society pages of the local newspaper. But Octavia's investigation had revealed cracks in the perfect facade. "She's been running a charity for the past 8 years, Octavia explained, pointing to financial documents. Hearts for Healing, focused on providing support for families dealing with childhood cancer. Very sympathetic cause, excellent for social credibility." But Zelma sensed there was more. The charity spends 67 cents of every dollar on administrative costs. Her own salary as executive director is $180,000 annually for what appears to be part-time work. They've helped exactly 11 families in 8 years, and most of that assistance was providing gift cards to restaurants. Zelma studied the financial statements, her historian's training helping her parse the complex web of transactions. She's basically paying herself to look charitable. It gets worse. 3 of the families they claim to have helped don't exist. The addresses correspond to vacant lots or businesses. She's been inflating her impact numbers to maintain grant funding from several major foundations. The evidence was damning, but Octavia wasn't finished. I also looked into her business ventures. She's been flipping houses in low-income neighborhoods, buying properties from elderly owners for well below market value. Her sales pitch emphasizes urgency, telling people they need to sell quickly before property values drop further. Then she renovates superficially and sells for 3 to 4 times what she paid. That sounds predatory, but is it illegal? The illegal part is that she's been misrepresenting her qualifications to secure development loans. She claims to have a degree in urban planning and 5 years of experience in property development. The degree doesn't exist, and her experience consists of flipping 12 houses while misrepresenting material defects to buyers. Zelma felt a familiar sensation, the same cold recognition she'd experienced when reading Temperance's letter. This was who Prudence had always been, someone who took what she wanted and justified it afterward. The only difference now was scale and sophistication. "What would you recommend?" she asked. Octavia smiled for the first time since they'd met. "I'd recommend you attend your reunion, Mrs. Whitmore. And I'd recommend you let her show you exactly who she still is." The Hillcrest High School gymnasium had been transformed with the kind of budget that suggested someone on the reunion committee had access to serious money. Twinkling lights hung from the rafters, round tables with white linens dotted the polished floor, and a professional DJ played carefully curated hits from their graduation year. Zelma arrived at exactly 7 p.m., as planned. She wore the same modest dress she'd originally chosen, carried the same simple purse. To anyone watching, she appeared to be exactly what she had always been. Unremarkable Zelma Pickering, now widowed, still living quietly in the same small city where she'd never quite belonged. She recognized faces immediately, the way you always do with people you've known during formative years. Time had softened some edges, sharpened others, but the essential architecture of personality remained visible beneath whatever changes the decades had wrought. "Zelma? Zelma Pickering?" She turned to find Millicent Hayes approaching with a genuine smile. Millicent had been the editor of the school newspaper, a serious girl who had shared Zelma's love of books and learning. She looked comfortable in her own skin in a way that suggested the intervening years had been kind to her. "It's Whitmore now," Zelma said, accepting a warm hug. "I heard about Erasmus." "I'm so sorry. He seemed like a wonderful man." They had known each other, of course. In a small city, paths crossed regularly. Millicent had bought insurance from Erasmus's company, had spoken highly of his honesty and fair dealing. He was. Zelma felt the familiar tightness in her chest that accompanied mentions of her late husband. "How have you been?" "Good. Really good. I'm teaching high school English now, actually. Here at Hillcrest." They fell into comfortable conversation, catching up on careers and families, mutual acquaintances and shared memories. Millicent had always been easy to talk to, someone who listened without judgment and responded with thoughtful questions rather than performative statements about her own experiences. "I have to ask," Millicent said after they'd found seats at a table near the back of the room, "are you planning to stay long? I know these things can be challenging," Zelma suggested. "I was going to say full of people who peaked in high school and don't know it yet, but challenging works too." Zelma laughed, a genuine sound that surprised her. She'd been so focused on the evening's larger purpose that she'd forgotten reunions could also involve reconnecting with people she'd actually liked. "I think I'll stay for a while," she said. "There are some conversations I've been meaning to have." As if summoned by the comment, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. Prudence Hartwell Morrison had arrived, and she had not come alone. Her husband accompanied her, along with what appeared to be a small entourage of former classmates who had maintained their high school allegiances into middle age. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had never questioned her right to be the center of attention. Her dress was designer, her jewelry substantial but tasteful, her confidence absolute. She moved through the gymnasium like she owned it, stopping to air-kiss acquaintances and pose for photographs with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Some things never change," Millicent murmured. Zelma watched Prudence work the room, noting the way conversation shifted when she approached, the way people rearranged themselves to accommodate her presence. She was still beautiful, still charismatic, still utterly certain of her own significance. And she was still cruel. Zelma observed as Prudence greeted Cornelius Blackwood, a former classmate who had struggled with his weight in high school and appeared to still be self-conscious about it. Her hug lasted just a moment too long. Her comments about how great he looked delivered with the subtle emphasis that made them sound patronizing rather than complimentary. She watched Prudence encounter Eugenia Thornfield, who had been openly lesbian in high school when such honesty required considerable courage. Prudence's smile was warm, her manner inclusive, but there was something performative about the interaction, as if she were demonstrating her evolved tolerance for the benefit of observers. She's gotten better at it, Zelma said quietly. Better at what? Being terrible. More sophisticated. Harder to call out. Millicent followed her gaze and nodded slowly. The worst bullies usually do. They learn to make it look like kindness. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Prudence's trajectory through the room finally brought her to Zelma's table. The encounter was inevitable. Zelma had chosen her seat specifically to ensure it would happen in the most public part of the gymnasium, with maximum witnesses. Zelma Pickering. Prudence's voice carried across nearby conversations, drawing attention as it always had. Oh my goodness, look at you. She approached with arms outstretched, as if they had been dear friends rather than antagonist and victim. The hug she delivered was theatrical, designed more for the audience than for Zelma herself. It's Whitmore now, Zelma said, the same correction she'd offered Millicent, but with less warmth. Of course. I heard about your husband. So tragic. Cancer, wasn't it? The comment was delivered with apparent sympathy, but there was something in Prudence's tone, a subtle satisfaction, perhaps, at being the person who got to acknowledge tragedy in someone else's life. Yes, Zelma said simply. Well, you look wonderful. Really wonderful. I always admired how you just stayed yourself, you know? Never tried to be something you weren't. It was a masterful comment, seemingly complimentary but actually condescending. Prudence was praising Zelma for remaining unremarkable, for never aspiring to more than her designated place in their shared social hierarchy. Thank you, Zelma said. You look very successful. Oh, well, Crispin and I have been blessed. Really blessed. The business has done well, the kids are thriving, and my charity work has been so rewarding. I'm sure you've heard about Hearts for Healing. I have. It's been amazing, really. Being able to help families during their darkest hours, providing real support when they need it most. It's taught me so much about what really matters in life. Prudence was performing now, aware that their conversation had drawn an audience. Several former classmates had drifted closer, listening to the exchange with the barely concealed fascination that social drama always provoked. That must be very fulfilling, Zelma said. It is. Although I have to say, it's also taught me to be more discerning about people's motivations. You'd be amazed how many people try to take advantage of genuine charitable efforts. People who see kindness as weakness, generosity as an opportunity. The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Prudence was building towards something, establishing a framework for whatever cruelty she had planned. I imagine that must be disappointing, Zelma said. It is. Take my sister's death, for example. Temperance was always so trusting, so willing to believe the best in people. I sometimes worry that people took advantage of that kindness, especially toward the end. Zelma felt her pulse quicken. This was not where she had expected the conversation to go. What do you mean? Prudence smiled, the expression sharp and knowing. Oh, I'm sure it's nothing. It's just that I recently learned about some financial arrangements Temperance made before her accident. Apparently, she left money to someone she barely knew. Someone from our high school class. The gymnasium seemed to have grown quieter, or perhaps Zelma was simply more attuned to the quality of attention surrounding them. How strange, she managed. Isn't it? I mean, I can understand wanting to help people, but when someone you barely spoke to suddenly becomes a beneficiary of your estate, well, it makes you wonder what kind of relationship might have existed. What kind of influence might have been exerted. The implication was clear, and it was devastating. Prudence was suggesting that Zelma had somehow manipulated a dying teenager into leaving her money. That she had been, in essence, a predator targeting someone vulnerable. I'm sure there must have been a good reason, Zelma said, her voice carefully neutral. I'm sure there was, Prudence agreed, her smile widening. Though I have to say, it does make me think about patterns of behavior. About people who seem to have a knack for being in the right place when tragedy strikes. Your husband's insurance policy must have been quite helpful after his passing. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Prudence was calling her a gold digger, but she was doing it with the kind of plausible deniability that had always been her specialty. To anyone not paying close attention, it might have sounded like idle speculation. But everyone was paying attention, and everyone understood exactly what was being suggested. Zelma felt the familiar sensation of being 17 again, standing in the cafeteria with her lunch tray, looking for somewhere to belong while Prudence held court at her table. The powerlessness, the humiliation, the certainty that there was no good response to public cruelty. But she wasn't 17 anymore. "You know what, Prudence?" Zelma said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet space around them. "You're absolutely right to be concerned about people who take advantage of others. It's such an important issue." She reached into her purse and withdrew her phone, as if checking for messages. What she was actually doing was activating the recording app that Cornelius had suggested she install. "In fact," she continued, "I've been learning so much about that lately. About people who exploit vulnerable populations, who use positions of trust to enrich themselves at others' expense. It's fascinating how creative some people can be when it comes to finding ways to profit from other people's suffering." Prudence's smile faltered slightly. There was something in Zelma's tone that didn't match the familiar script of their past interactions. "I suppose you're right," Prudence said carefully. "Oh, I know I am. For instance, did you know that the average legitimate charity spends less than 20% of its budget on administrative costs? Anything above 30% is generally considered a red flag for potential fraud." The silence around them had become complete. Zelma was aware of faces turning toward their conversation, of the subtle shift in attention that occurred when social drama promised to become genuinely interesting. I'm not sure I follow," Prudence said. "I've been doing some reading about charitable organizations lately. It's amazing how much information is publicly available if you know where to look. Tax filings, grant applications, donor reports. All public record, really." Zelma's voice remained conversational, almost academic, as if she were discussing a mildly interesting historical phenomenon rather than delivering a calculated attack. Hearts for Healing, for example. Such a beautiful name for an organization. So evocative. Though I have to say, when I looked at the actual impact numbers, I was surprised by how few families have been helped relative to the budget. Prudence's face had gone very still. "I don't know what you think you'll." 11 families in 8 years, Zelma continued gently. "With an average annual budget of nearly $300,000. That works out to about $27,000 per family helped, which seems like it should provide substantial assistance. But then, of course, administrative costs do add up. I think there might be some misunderstanding." "Oh, I'm sure there is. There usually is when people start asking specific questions about finances. It's so easy for numbers to be misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of charitable work." Zelma smiled, the expression warm and sympathetic. "I'm sure someone with your experience in property development would be much better equipped to explain how these organizations actually function." It was a surgical strike. Zelma had just revealed that she knew about both the charity fraud and the property schemes, while doing so in a way that sounded like innocent curiosity rather than accusation. Prudence's composure cracked visibly. "I think you're confused about." "Am I? How embarrassing. I do hate being wrong about things. Perhaps we should ask your husband to clarify? He must be so proud of your charitable work. And your business ventures, of course." Crispin Morrison had been standing a few feet away, engaged in conversation with other reunion attendees, but he was clearly listening now. His expression suggested he was hearing some of this information for the first time. "I think," Prudence said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "that you're exactly what you've always been. Someone who tries to tear down people who've actually accomplished something with their lives." It was the response Zelma had been waiting for, the moment when Prudence's mask would slip, when her true nature would reassert itself under pressure. "You know what you are?" Prudence continued, her voice rising slightly. "You're a gold digger. You always have been. First my sister, now your dead husband, probably looking for your next target right here tonight. Some people never change." The words echoed across the gymnasium with perfect clarity. Dozens of people heard them, including several who were recording the exchange on their phones. In an era when everything was documented and shared, Prudence had just provided incontrovertible evidence of her character. Zelma smiled. "You know what, Prudence?" she said, her voice carrying the same gentle tone she'd maintained throughout the conversation. I think you're right. Some people never change. She gathered her purse and stood, nodding politely to the circle of fascinated observers. It was lovely seeing everyone, she said. I hope you all have a wonderful evening. She walked toward the exit with unhurried dignity, leaving behind a gymnasium full of people who had just witnessed something they would be talking about for years to come. Behind her, she could hear Prudence's voice, louder now, trying to explain herself to her husband and friends, trying to walk back words that could not be taken back. Zelma pushed through the gymnasium doors and walked into the cool October night, pulling out her phone as she reached her car. Cornelius, she said when the lawyer answered. I think it's time to have those conversations we discussed. The meeting took place in Cornelius Ashworth's office the following Monday morning. Present were Zelma, Cornelius, Octavia Reeves the private investigator, and a woman Zelma had not met before, Imogene Fairchild, an assistant district attorney who specialized in financial crimes. The recording from the reunion is useful, Imogene said, reviewing the transcript Cornelius had prepared, but it's primarily valuable as evidence of character rather than admission of criminal behavior. She spread several documents across the conference table: bank statements, tax filings, incorporation papers, property records. However, combined with the financial evidence Ms. Reeves has compiled, we have the foundation for several potential charges. Wire fraud related to the grant applications, mail fraud for the property transactions involving misrepresentation, and potentially racketeering if we can establish a pattern of coordinated fraudulent activity. Zelma studied the papers, trying to process the magnitude of what was being presented. How much money are we talking about? Conservatively, about $1.2 million over the past 5 years. The charity fraud accounts for roughly $400,000, the property scheme for the remainder, and the families she claimed to help. 3 don't exist at all. The addresses correspond to vacant lots. For more received minimal assistance, far less than what was reported to grant-making organizations. The remaining 4 received help that was legitimate but substantially exaggerated in impact reports. Octavia added. We also found evidence that she's been using the charity as a vehicle for money laundering from the property sales. Inflated administrative payments to shell companies she controls, equipment purchases that can't be accounted for, consulting fees paid to fictional advisors. Zelma felt a familiar sensation, the same cold recognition that had accompanied her first reading of Temperance's letter. The scope of Prudence's corruption was breathtaking, but it was also perfectly consistent with the character she had displayed 25 years ago. The methods had evolved, but the essential selfishness remained unchanged. What would prosecution look like? She asked. Federal charges, most likely, Imogene replied. Mail and wire fraud are federal crimes, and the interstate nature of some of the transactions would support federal jurisdiction. We're looking at potential sentences of 10 to 15 years, substantial financial penalties, and complete restitution to victims. Victims? The families who were denied help because grant money was diverted. The elderly property owners who were defrauded. The legitimate charities who were denied funding because grants went to a fraudulent organization instead. Cornelius leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to be clear about something. Once we initiate this process, there's no controlling how it unfolds. Federal prosecutors don't negotiate based on personal feelings or past grievances. They pursue justice according to the law. You're asking if I'm doing this for the right reasons. I'm asking if you're prepared for the reality that this will destroy her life completely. Her marriage, her social standing, her freedom, everything will be gone. And it will be very public, very permanent. Zelma thought about Erasmus, about the quiet dignity with which he had faced his diagnosis, the way he had worried more about her future than his own suffering. She thought about Temperance, 18 years old and dying, spending her final months creating tools for accountability that she would never see used. The family she stole from, Zelma said finally. What happens to them? Restitution would be ordered as part of any plea agreement or sentence, Imogene explained. The elderly property owners would receive the difference between what they were paid and fair market value. The grant money would be returned to the foundations for redistribution to legitimate charities. So the people she hurt would be made whole? As much as possible, yes. Zelma nodded slowly. Then yes, I'm prepared. The next several hours were spent reviewing evidence, planning strategy, and preparing the documentation that would be submitted to the U.S. Attorney's Office. The case was solid, built on years of documented fraud and supported by physical evidence that Prudence would be unable to explain away. As the meeting concluded, Cornelius handed Zelma a final folder. "Temperance's personal effects," he said. "Her parents asked me to give these to you when the trust was executed." Inside were photographs, letters, small mementos from a life cut short. At the bottom was a diary, its pages filled with the careful handwriting Zelma had come to recognize. That evening, she sat in her living room, Erasmus's chair still positioned beside hers, and read through the diary's final entries. They were the thoughts of a young woman grappling with mortality, but also with questions of justice and accountability that seemed remarkably mature for someone just 18. "I keep thinking about the story of the Judgment of Solomon," one entry read. "Two women claiming the same baby, and Solomon threatens to cut it in half to see who the real mother is. The real mother would rather give up the baby than see it harmed. But what if the situation were different? What if the false mother was someone who had been hurting the baby all along? Wouldn't the real act of love be making sure she could never hurt anyone again?" Another entry, dated just 3 days before her death. "I saw Prudence make that girl cry again today. Just for sport, just because she could. Nobody said anything. Nobody ever says anything. I used to think that made me complicit, but now I think maybe there are different ways to speak up. Maybe sometimes you have to wait for the right moment, the right opportunity. Maybe justice doesn't always happen immediately, but it happens eventually if someone cares enough to make it happen." The final entry was brief. "I've done what I can. The rest is up to time and the choices other people make. I hope whoever inherits this responsibility uses it better than I could." The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in November, just 2 weeks after the reunion. Zelma learned about it from the local news, which led their morning broadcast with footage of Prudence Hartwell Morrison being led from her house in handcuffs, her attorney shouting "no comment" to reporters' questions. The charges were extensive: mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. The federal indictment ran to 47 pages and detailed a pattern of criminal behavior stretching back nearly a decade. Zelma watched the coverage from her kitchen, drinking coffee from Erasmus's mug. She had finally watched it the previous week and decided it was time to use it again. The news report included statements from the U.S. Attorney's Office about protecting vulnerable populations from predatory behavior, quotes from the FBI about the importance of holding charitable organizations accountable, and brief interviews with some of the elderly victims who had been defrauded in the property scheme. What struck her most was how ordinary it all seemed on television. Years of systematic theft and deception reduced to a 3-minute news segment, complete with file footage of the defendant at various charity functions and social events. The magnitude of the betrayal was somehow diminished by the familiar format of local crime reporting. Her phone rang as the broadcast concluded. "Mrs. Whitmore? This is Millicent Hayes. From the reunion." "Hello, Millicent. I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from the school directory. I just wanted to, well, I wanted to see how you were doing after everything that's happened." "I'm fine. Thank you. I have to ask, and please feel free to tell me it's none of my business, but did you know? At the reunion, when she was saying those things to you, did you already know about the charges?" Zelma considered her response carefully. "I knew she hadn't changed. The whole thing is just, it's incredible, really. I mean, we all knew she could be cruel, but this level of theft from people who were trying to help sick children? It's sociopathic." "Yes," Zelma said simply. "I keep thinking about what you said that night, about people who exploit vulnerable populations. You seem to know exactly what kind of person she was. Some people never change, Millicent. They just get better at hiding who they really are." There was a pause before Millicent spoke again. "I also keep thinking about how she attacked you, calling you a gold digger, implying that you had somehow taken advantage of her sister and your husband. It was so vicious, so calculated. It was who she's always been. But here's what I can't stop thinking about. She was accusing you of exactly what she had been doing herself. Exploiting tragedy, taking money from people who were vulnerable. It's like she was confessing without realizing it." Zelma had not considered this interpretation, but she recognized its truth immediately. Prudence's attack had been pure projection, an unconscious admission of her own guilt. "I suppose it was," she said. "Are you going to be okay through all of this? The trial, I mean, if you have to testify?" "I think so. I have good legal representation." After they hung up, Zelma sat in the growing afternoon light, thinking about cycles of cruelty and accountability. Prudence would likely plea bargain, accepting a reduced sentence in exchange for full restitution and cooperation with ongoing investigations into similar charity fraud schemes. She would spend several years in federal prison, lose her house and social standing, and emerge into a world where her reputation had been permanently destroyed. It was, Zelma realized, exactly the kind of consequence that might have prevented years of additional victims if it had occurred earlier. Temperance had been right about the importance of accountability, about the damage that unchecked cruelty could inflict over time. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. On her porch stood a woman she didn't recognize, middle-aged, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. "Mrs. Whitmore? I'm Arabella Chin. My mother was Mrs. Chin on Maple Street. I think you might have heard about what happened to her." Zelma had indeed heard. Mrs. Chin had been one of the elderly victims of Prudence's property scheme, pressured into selling her house for far below market value when she needed money for medical expenses. "Please, come in." They sat in the living room, and Arabella explained that she had driven from 3 states away when she learned about her mother's situation from news coverage of the arrest. "Mama never told me what happened," she said. "She was too ashamed, I think. She thought she had made a bad business decision, didn't realize she had been deliberately deceived." "I'm so sorry. The thing is, the prosecutor says there will be restitution, but Mama died 6 months ago. The stress of losing the house, having to move to that terrible apartment. I think it broke her heart, literally." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unintended consequences settling between them. "I don't want money," Arabella continued. "I mean, I'll accept whatever restitution is ordered because it's what Mama would have wanted. But what I really want is for people to understand what this kind of theft actually costs. It's not just money. It's dignity, security, trust in other people. It's years of life lost to stress and worry. Would you be willing to speak at the sentencing hearing?" "Yes. Absolutely yes." After Arabella left, Zelma called Cornelius to relay the conversation and discuss the impact statements that would be presented during sentencing. The human cost of financial fraud was often overlooked in favor of dollar amounts and legal technicalities, but victims like Mrs. Chin represented the real consequences of systematic cruelty. That evening, she returned to Temperance's diary, reading the entries that dealt with questions of proportionate justice and moral accountability. "I don't want revenge," one passage read. "Revenge is about making yourself feel better. I want justice, which is about making sure the harm stops and the people who were hurt get some measure of restoration. Those are different things, even though they sometimes look the same from the outside." The plea hearing took place on a cold morning in February. Prudence Hartwell Morrison, dressed in a conservative navy suit that made her look smaller and older than she had at the reunion, stood before a federal judge and admitted to 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy. Her voice was barely audible as she acknowledged each charge, confirming that she understood the consequences of her plea and was entering it voluntarily. Gone was the confident woman who had commanded attention at every high school gathering, replaced by someone who seemed to have diminished physically under the weight of public disgrace. Zelma sat in the gallery with Cornelius, watching the legal machinery process a case that had begun with an 18-year-old girl's determination to create accountability for cruelty. The courtroom was half empty. Financial fraud lacked the dramatic appeal of violent crime, and media interest had faded since the initial arrest. The sentencing hearing, scheduled for the following month, would be different. That was when the victims would have their opportunity to speak, when the human cost of Prudence's actions would be presented in detail to the judge who would determine her punishment. As they left the courthouse, Cornelius handed Zelma a folder containing the final financial accounting of Temperance's trust. "After legal fees and investigative costs, there's still approximately $360,000 remaining," he said. Temperance's instructions were clear about how any remaining funds should be distributed. Zelma opened the folder and read the carefully typed document inside. The remaining money was to be used to establish a scholarship fund at their high school, specifically for students who had demonstrated resilience in the face of social adversity. The selection criteria were precise. Academic achievement was less important than character, and preference should be given to those who had experienced systematic exclusion or bullying. "She thought of everything," Zelma said. "She did. There's also a provision for you to serve on the selection committee, if you're willing." That afternoon, Zelma drove to the cemetery where Temperance was buried. She had visited once before, shortly after learning about the trust, but this felt different. More final, somehow, as if a cycle were completing itself. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with Temperance's name, dates, and a single line, "She saw clearly and acted bravely." Below that, a small inscription, "Justice delayed is not justice denied." Zelma placed a small bouquet of winter flowers at the base of the stone and stood for several minutes in the cold February air, thinking about the strange architecture of accountability that had connected their lives across 25 years. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Millicent Hayes. Saw the news about the plea. How are you feeling? Zelma typed back, like something that needed to happen finally did. The response came quickly. The scholarship fund is a beautiful idea. Temperance would be proud. Word of the scholarship had spread quickly through their former classmates, generating a response that surprised Zelma with its enthusiasm. Several people had contacted Cornelius about making additional contributions, wanting to support the fund's mission of helping students who face social exclusion. Eugenia Thornfield, the woman who had been openly gay in high school, sent a check for $5,000 along with a note, for all the kids who eat lunch alone because they don't fit in. Maybe this will help them know that it gets better, and that someone is paying attention. Cornelius Blackwood, who had struggled with weight issues and social anxiety, contributed $3,000 and volunteered to mentor scholarship recipients who were interested in careers in science and technology. Even some of Prudence's former friends had quietly reached out, apparently recognizing that their silence during years of systematic cruelty had made them complicit in the harm that followed. The most surprising response came from Crispin Morrison, Prudence's soon-to-be ex-husband. His attorney contacted Cornelius with an offer to match the scholarship fund's initial amount, doubling its potential impact. He wants to do something constructive, Cornelius explained when he relayed the offer. Apparently, he's discovered that he was married to someone he never really knew, and he's trying to process that reality. What about their children? They're struggling, as you'd expect. Their mother's actions have destroyed their sense of security and trust. He's hoping that supporting something positive might help them understand that people can choose to respond to harm by preventing future harm. Zelma approved the matching contribution, understanding that healing sometimes required former bystanders to become active participants in justice. The sentencing hearing took place on a surprisingly warm day in March, one of those early spring afternoons when winter's grip finally begins to loosen. The courtroom was fuller this time, occupied by victims, family members, attorneys, and a handful of reporters covering the conclusion of a case that had captured local attention. Zelma sat in the front row as Arabella Chin approached the podium to deliver her victim impact statement. Her voice was steady as she described her mother's final months, the way systematic deception had stripped away not just financial security but also the dignity and independence that had defined Mrs. Chin's long life. My mother came to this country with nothing, Arabella said, looking directly at Prudence, who sat at the defendant's table with her head bowed. She worked for 60 years to build something to leave her family. She trusted people because that's who she was, someone who believed that if you treated others with respect and fairness, they would do the same for you. The next speaker was Barnabas Quinton, representing a foundation that had provided grants to Hearts for Healing based on fraudulent impact reports. He explained that the diverted money represented assistance that could have helped dozens of families facing childhood cancer, medical bills, and emotional trauma. When charitable organizations lie about their effectiveness, he said, they don't just steal money. They steal hope from people who desperately need help, and they damage the trust that makes legitimate charitable work possible. Several other victims spoke, each describing the specific ways that Prudence's actions had affected their lives. The cumulative impact was devastating, painting a picture of systematic harm that had rippled outward from individual acts of fraud to damage entire communities. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Octavius Pemberton addressed Prudence directly. Mrs. Morrison, you have the opportunity to address the court before I impose sentence. Do you wish to make a statement? Prudence rose slowly, her hands visibly shaking as she gripped the podium. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the judge had to ask her to repeat herself. I want to say that I'm sorry, she began, then stopped, seemingly overwhelmed by the inadequacy of the words. I know that doesn't mean anything to the people I hurt. I know it doesn't undo what I did. She paused, taking a shuddering breath. I used to think I deserved things because I was smart, because I worked hard, because I came from a good family. I thought other people's problems weren't my responsibility, and I thought taking advantage of opportunities was just business. Another pause, longer this time. I don't know when I stopped being a person who cared about other people and became someone who only cared about myself. Maybe it happened gradually, or maybe I was always like this and just got better at hiding it. She looked up for the first time, her eyes finding Zelma in the gallery. Someone I knew in high school told me recently that some people never change. She was right about me. I never changed, I just got more sophisticated about being selfish. The acknowledgement hung in the air like an admission of fundamental character failure. I can't undo what I did, but I want people to know that I understand now what it cost. Not just money, but trust and dignity and security. I stole years of peace from people who deserved better. She sat down, and Judge Pemberton spent several minutes reviewing the sentencing guidelines and the factors that would influence his decision. Mrs. Morrison, he said finally, your crimes represent a systematic betrayal of trust that extended over nearly a decade. You exploited the vulnerability of elderly citizens, defrauded charitable foundations, and diverted resources from families facing medical crises. He outlined the terms of the sentence: 7 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibition from serving in any fiduciary capacity for charitable organizations. The court notes your expression of remorse, he continued, but also recognizes that the harm you caused was both extensive and intentional. The sentence reflects the seriousness of your crimes and the need to deter similar conduct by others. As the hearing concluded and Prudence was led away to begin serving her sentence, Zelma felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was satisfaction in seeing accountability finally imposed, but also a profound sadness for all the unnecessary harm that could have been prevented if consequences had come earlier. Outside the courthouse, Cornelius handed her a final envelope. The last of Temperance's instructions, he said. She wanted you to have this after the legal proceedings were complete. Inside was a single photograph, Temperance and Prudence as children, perhaps 6 and 4 years old, sitting together on a porch swing. They were laughing at something beyond the camera's view, their faces bright with uncomplicated joy. On the back, in Temperance's careful handwriting, she wasn't always who she became. I hope you remember that justice isn't about punishment. It's about making sure the harm stops and the healing can begin. 5 years later, Zelma stood in the auditorium of Hillcrest High School, watching as the third class of Temperance Hartwell Scholarship recipients received their awards. The fund had grown beyond their initial hopes, supporting not just college expenses but also mentoring programs and counseling services for students facing social adversity. The current recipient, a quiet young woman named Serafina who had been bullied for her unconventional interests and appearance, was speaking about the difference the scholarship had made in her life. Before this program, I thought I was the problem, she said, her voice growing stronger as she continued. I thought there was something wrong with me because I didn't fit in with the other kids. But the scholarship committee helped me understand that being different isn't a flaw, it's just being yourself. In the audience, Zelma spotted several familiar faces from her own high school years. Millicent Hayes, now the school's principal, sat in the front row. Eugenia Thornfield, who had become a successful advocate for LGBTQ+ youth, served on the scholarship selection committee. Cornelius Blackwood had established an internship program that paired scholarship recipients with local businesses. Even some of Prudence's former friends had become involved, apparently motivated by a desire to make amends for their past complicity and systematic cruelty. They volunteered as mentors, contributed financially, and helped create an environment where social exclusion was actively discouraged rather than passively tolerated. The transformation hadn't been immediate or complete. High school social dynamics were ancient and persistent, resistant to change imposed from above. But the scholarship program had created space for different conversations, different values, different definitions of success and worth. After the ceremony, Zelma walked through the hallways where she had once felt invisible, noting the anti-bullying posters, the peer mediation programs, the explicit emphasis on inclusion and respect that now characterized the school's culture. It wasn't perfect, no institution ever was, but it was better. She stopped at the memorial display case that honored Temperance's memory and the scholarship program that bore her name. Inside were photographs of recipients, updates on their achievements, and letters describing how the program had affected their lives. One letter, from a graduate who was now studying social work, read, I used to think that cruelty was just part of life, that some people were meant to be targets and others were meant to be powerful. The scholarship taught me that those aren't natural laws, they're choices. And if they're choices, they can be changed. Another, from a young man who had been mercilessly bullied for his speech impediment, the scholarship didn't just pay for college. It taught me that my worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. It gave me permission to believe that I deserved respect and kindness, not because I had earned them, but because they're basic human rights. Zelma's phone buzzed with a text from Cornelius. The restitution payments to Mrs. Chin's family were completed today. Full amount plus interest, as ordered. She typed back, good. How's the daughter doing? Better. She started a nonprofit focused on protecting elderly people from financial exploitation. Wants to make sure what happened to her mother doesn't happen to others. As she walked to her car, Zelma reflected on the strange mathematics of justice, the way individual acts of accountability could multiply into broader social change. Temperance's trust had been designed to address specific harm, but its impact had expanded far beyond the original parameters. Prudence was scheduled for release in 2 years, having served the majority of her sentence. She would emerge into a world that had moved on without her, where her former social status was permanently lost and her opportunities for rebuilding were severely limited. Whether she would use that experience to become genuinely different or simply more careful about hiding who she was remained to be seen. But the scholarship program would continue regardless, creating opportunities for students who might otherwise remain invisible, providing support for those who face systematic exclusion, and gradually changing the culture that had once allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. Driving home through the quiet streets of the city where she had always lived, Zelma thought about Erasmus, about the conversation they might have had about justice and redemption and the long arc of moral accountability. He would have been proud, she thought, of the way she had chosen to use Temperance's gift, not for revenge, but for prevention. The late afternoon sun slanted through her windshield as she pulled into her driveway, illuminating the modest house where she had built a life with someone who had loved her exactly as she was. Inside, the silence was no longer oppressive but peaceful, filled with the memory of shared laughter and quiet contentment. She made herself tea in Erasmus's favorite mug and sat in the living room where they had spent so many evenings together, thinking about the strange trajectory that had brought her from that gymnasium confrontation to this moment of quiet satisfaction. On the table beside her chair lay the latest report from the Scholarship Committee, detailing the program's expansion to include anti-bullying education and peer counseling training. Attached was a note from Millicent Hayes. Temperance would be amazed by what her trust has accomplished. You've turned her desire for justice into something that creates healing instead of just imposing consequences. As darkness settled over the city, Zelma opened her laptop and began working on her monthly letter to the scholarship recipients, the message she sent to remind them that their experiences mattered, their resilience was valuable, and their futures were worth investing in. She began, as she always did, with words that Temperance had written in her diary nearly 30 years ago. The most important thing is not whether you were hurt, but whether you choose to prevent others from being hurt in the same way. Outside, the night was calm and clear, full of possibilities that hadn't existed when she was 17 and eating lunch alone, wondering if anyone would ever see her as worthy of attention and respect. Now she knew the answer. Everyone was worthy, everyone deserved to be seen, and sometimes it took decades for justice to find its way from intention to reality. But it found its way eventually, if someone cared enough to make sure it did.